Homeless twins beg a man to enter his house, and the moment he sees their faces, he bursts into tears. He's never seen them before, but somehow they're connected to the biggest regret of his life. Two little black girls, shivering in the snow, whisper two simple words that bring him to his knees. Why did they come to door? What secret do they carry? And what did he do all those years ago that shattered their mother's life? This is a powerful story of guilt, redemption, and the heartbreaking cost of looking away when someone needs help the most. Don't miss what happens next. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Robert Marston sat alone in his study, surrounded by the familiar comfort of aged, leather-bound books and antique furniture that filled his Victorian home. The gentle hiss of snow falling outside created a peaceful backdrop to the crackling fireplace. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he prepared his evening tea, measuring loose leaves into the strainer, just as he had done thousands of times before. The study, like the rest of his house, was a testament to order and routine. Dark wooden shelves lined the walls, each book perfectly aligned with its neighbors. The brass desk lamp cast a warm circle of light onto the polished surface of his writing desk, where an old leather briefcase lay open. Robert settled into his high-backed chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. Steam rose from the delicate porcelain teacup at his elbow as he began sorting through the stack of yellowed files from the briefcase. Each document represented a piece of his past. Contracts, amendments, corporate dealings that had once seemed so important, but now felt hollow. His fingers traced over the typed words of a particularly thick file, and he felt the familiar twist of guilt in his stomach. The papers were worn at the corners from years of handling, though he had never actually filed them away properly. Perhaps he had kept them as some form of self-punishment, a reminder of choices made in boardrooms that had affected real lives beyond those walls. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, its deep resonance echoing through the quiet house. Robert took a sip of his tea, letting the warm liquid soothe his throat as he continued his solitary review of the past. Then he heard it, a soft tap against glass so faint he might have imagined it. He paused, teacup halfway to his lips, listening. The sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. Gentle, but with a rhythm that suggested purpose rather than accident. Must be ice forming on the windows, he muttered to himself, trying to focus back on the documents before him. But the tapping continued, growing neither louder nor softer, maintaining its steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The persistence of the sound began to nag at him. Ice didn't tap with such regularity. He found himself straining to listen, the words on the page before him blurring as his attention shifted entirely to that gentle percussion against the window. Finally, unable to concentrate, Robert pushed back from his desk. His joints protested as he stood, reminding him of his age. The tapping continued as he crossed the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick oriental rug. The heavy burgundy curtains were drawn against the winter night, and Robert hesitated for a moment before reaching for them. The tapping seemed to grow more urgent, though no louder. Tap, 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 tap. With a swift motion, he pulled back the curtain. The sudden movement sent the fabric swaying, creating dancing shadows in the firelight. But Robert noticed none of this, because what he saw through the frosted glass struck him with the force of a physical blow. 2 little girls stood in the falling snow, their dark faces barely visible in the weak light spilling from his window. They were identical in every way, same height, same features, same tattered coats that were wholly inadequate for the winter weather. Their small hands were bare, and one of them had her palm pressed against the glass, creating that soft, desperate tapping that had drawn him from his desk. But it was their eyes that brought Robert Marston to his knees. Large, dark eyes that seemed to hold knowledge far beyond their years, staring directly into his with an intensity that shattered every wall he had built around himself over the decades. The teacup slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the room. Hot tea spread across the wooden floorboards, but Robert barely noticed. His vision blurred as tears welled up and spilled down his cheeks, the first tears he had shed in more years than he could remember. He remained there on his knees, one hand pressed against the cold glass, mirroring the small hand on the other side, as the snow continued to fall silently in the darkness beyond. The twins didn't move, didn't speak, just kept their steady gaze fixed on him. Their presence felt impossible, yet undeniable. Through his tears, Robert could see them shivering in the cold, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The enormity of what he was seeing, what it meant, crashed over him in waves. Each sob that racked his body seemed to break loose another piece of the carefully constructed armor he had worn for so long. The weight of past decisions, of signatures on papers that had affected lives he had never wanted to see, pressed down on him with crushing force. There, kneeling on his study floor with broken porcelain scattered around him, Robert Marston faced a moment of truth that all his legal expertise and carefully maintained distance could not shield him from. The twin girls outside his window stood as living testimony to the real-world consequences of boardroom decisions made long ago, their presence both an accusation and a chance for redemption. Robert snapped out of his daze, his heart pounding against his ribs. The girls were still there, shivering in the snow, their small faces pressed against the window. He scrambled to his feet, nearly slipping on the spilled tea as he rushed from his study toward the front door. His trembling fingers fumbled with the locks, deadbolt, chain, handle lock. Each click seemed to take an eternity. Finally, he yanked the heavy oak door open, and a blast of bitter winter air rushed into the warm house, carrying swirls of snow with it. Come in quickly," he urged, his voice hoarse with emotion. The twin girls hesitated for just a moment before stepping over the threshold. Their movements were synchronized, as if they shared a single mind. Their shoes, worn tennis shoes, not proper winter boots, left wet marks on the polished hardwood floor. Robert's mind raced as he closed the door against the howling wind. The girls stood motionless in his foyer, small puddles forming beneath their feet as snow melted from their clothes. Their matching coats were pitifully thin, the fabric worn through at the elbows. "This way," he said, gesturing toward the living room where the fireplace burned steadily. "Let's get you warm." He hurried to the hall closet, pulling out every blanket he could find. Old quilts, wool throws, even the decorative afghan his sister had given him years ago. The girls followed him silently to the fireplace, their movements cautious but not fearful. Robert spread one of the quilts on the floor in front of the hearth. "Sit here," he said softly, as if speaking to frightened birds that might take flight at any moment. They settled onto the blanket, and he draped the others around their shoulders. "Let's get those wet shoes off," he said, kneeling in front of them. The tennis shoes were soaked through, the canvas falling apart at the seams. He untied the knotted laces with gentle fingers, easing the sodden shoes off their feet. Their socks were just as wet, and he removed those too, revealing small feet reddened by the cold. One of the girls, the one sitting slightly closer to the fire, began to cough, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep in her chest. Her sister reached over and rubbed her back with a small hand. "I'm Nia," the second girl said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Lena." She didn't offer any other information, just continued rubbing her sister's back as another coughing fit shook her small frame. Robert nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm Robert. Are you hungry? I can make some soup." Both girls nodded, their eyes following his movements as he stood. "Where?" He hesitated, not wanting to frighten them. "Where is your mother?" The question hung in the air, met with silence. Lena's coughing had subsided, but neither girl answered. They just pulled the blankets tighter around their shoulders and stared into the fire. Robert noticed a small backpack hanging from Nia's shoulder, its blue fabric as worn as their coats. "I'll get some towels for your hair," he said, stepping back, "and then we'll have that soup." The linen closet was at the end of the hall, and as he pulled out several fluffy towels, he could hear movement in the living room. When he returned, Nia had the backpack open in her lap. Her small hand disappeared inside and emerged holding something that made Robert's breath catch in his throat, a business card. The card was creased and worn, its once crisp edges softened by time and handling. But the embossed logo of his old law firm was still clearly visible, as was his name. Robert J. Marston, printed in elegant serif font. He stared at it, memories flooding back of the countless times he had handed out identical cards in boardrooms and cocktail parties. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Nia's dark eyes met his directly. "It was in Mommy's coat," she said simply, as if those 5 words didn't just shatter Robert's world all over again. Hours later, long after he had fed the girls soup and settled them in his guest room with fresh pajamas that swallowed their small frames, Robert sat on the edge of his bed. The business card was still in his hands and he couldn't stop staring at it. Outside, the storm continued to rage, throwing snow against his windows with increasing fury. The card felt impossibly heavy in his hands, weighted down with implications he wasn't ready to face. His name stared back at him, accusing in its pristine typography. In the darkness of his bedroom, with only the storm for company, Robert Marston held his past in his hands and found sleep impossible. The winter morning light crept through the frost-covered windows, casting long shadows across Robert's kitchen. He moved quietly, trying not to wake the girls who were still asleep on the couch in the adjacent living room. Their small forms were bundled in layers of quilts, only their peaceful faces visible in the soft morning light. Robert cracked eggs into a bowl, his movements mechanical as his mind wandered. The business card lay on the kitchen table, catching glints of early sunlight. He glanced at it between tasks, beating eggs, buttering bread for toast, setting out plates. The name Deacon kept tugging at something in his memory, like a loose thread he couldn't quite grasp. The wind whistled outside, rattling the old windows. Inside, the house was almost eerily quiet, except for the gentle breathing of the sleeping children and the soft clink of utensils as Robert prepared breakfast. He sat down at the table, coffee cup warming his hands, and picked up the card again. Something about that name. Suddenly, his hand froze halfway to his mouth, coffee forgotten. Deacon. Mara Deacon. The memory hit him like a physical blow, sending him stumbling to his feet. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound harsh in the quiet morning. Robert glanced at the girls to make sure he hadn't woken them, then hurried to the narrow door that led to the attic stairs. His feet carried him up the creaking steps 2 at a time, his heart pounding with a desperate urgency he hadn't felt in years. The attic air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old papers. Boxes lined the walls, some labeled with dates, others with case numbers or client names. Robert's hands shook as he moved from box to box, scanning labels in the dim light filtering through the small window. There, a box marked Internship Program 2016 to 2017. He pulled it down, sending a cascade of dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight. The cardboard was soft with age, the corners crushed. Inside, manila folders were arranged alphabetically, their tabs faded but still readable. His fingers moved through the files. Campbell, Chen, Davidson, Deacon. Robert pulled the folder out, his throat tight. Internship. Deacon Mara was written in his own neat handwriting across the tab. The folder was thin, containing just a few sheets of paper. On top was a recommendation letter he'd drafted but never sent. His eyes skimmed the words. Exceptional analytical skills. Natural leadership ability. Bright future in corporate law. The praise went on and on, all of it true, none of it ever shared. Behind the recommendation was a handwritten note on lined paper, the blue ink slightly smudged. Robert recognized Mara's neat, determined handwriting immediately. "Mr. Marston, please, I need help. My family is being evicted. The new regulations in Clause 17 mean we don't qualify for housing assistance anymore. I know you're busy, but could we talk for just a few minutes? I wouldn't ask if I had anywhere else to turn. Mara." Robert's legs gave out and he sank to the dusty attic floor. He remembered now, remembered brushing past her desk that day, barely glancing at the note she'd left. He'd been too focused on polishing the final draft of Clause 17, too busy with meetings and deadlines and billable hours. He told himself he'd deal with it later, that it wasn't his problem. The sound of movement downstairs pulled him from his memories. He carefully returned the folder to its box, his movements slow and heavy with guilt. By the time he made it back to the kitchen, the girls were awake, sitting close together on the couch. They'd folded the quilts neatly, stacking them at one end of the couch. Their clothes from yesterday were still damp, hanging over the back of a chair near the fireplace. They wore the oversized t-shirts he'd given them to sleep in, the fabric reaching almost to their ankles. "Good morning," Robert said softly, trying to keep his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Are you hungry?" "I made breakfast." The girls nodded, following him to the kitchen table where he'd set out plates of scrambled eggs and toast. They sat close together, their movements still cautious and synchronized. Robert noticed how they watched him, their dark eyes missing nothing. They ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the food might disappear. Robert busied himself at the counter, giving them space while staying nearby. He could hear them whispering to each other, too quiet for him to make out the words. Finally, Nia spoke up, her voice small but clear in the quiet kitchen. "Are we staying here forever?" Robert's hands stilled on the dish he was washing. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications he wasn't prepared to address. He couldn't bring himself to answer, couldn't find words that wouldn't feel like either a promise or a betrayal. Instead, he dried his hands and walked to the living room window. The snow had stopped, but the world outside was blanketed in white, pristine and untouched. The morning sun made the snow sparkle like diamond dust. Behind him, he could hear the quiet sounds of the girls finishing their breakfast. Robert picked up the phone from its cradle on the wall, his movements deliberate. First, he dialed his private physician, Dr. Chen. The girls needed to be checked for frostbite, for the cough he'd heard in Lena's chest, for who knew what other effects of exposure to the cold. After arranging for a house call later that morning, he dialed a second number, one he knew by heart despite not having called it in years. The familiar digits felt like lead on his fingers. His old firm's main line. A cheerful receptionist answered with the firm's name, her voice bright and professional. Robert stood silent, listening to the familiar greeting, to the busy sounds of office life in the background. His free hand clenched into a fist at his side. After a moment, he placed the receiver back in its cradle without speaking a word. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the living room windows as Dr. Patel set her medical bag on the coffee table. She was a small woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The girls sat together on the couch, watching her every move with cautious attention. "I've known Dr. Patel for many years," Robert explained softly to the twins. "She's here to make sure you're both healthy." He stood nearby, his presence steady but not hovering, giving them space while remaining close enough to reassure. Dr. Patel smiled warmly as she pulled out her stethoscope. "May I listen to your hearts?" she asked, demonstrating on herself first. Lena nodded, though she gripped her sister's hand tightly. The examination proceeded slowly, with Dr. Patel explaining each step before she took it. She checked their temperatures, looked in their throats, tested their reflexes. Robert watched from his position by the fireplace, his face carefully neutral despite the concern in his eyes. "The younger one, Lena, yes, has a mild chest infection," Dr. Patel explained to Robert as she packed up her supplies. "Nothing too serious, but we'll want to keep an eye on it. They're both underweight and showing signs of vitamin deficiency." She pulled out several bottles of children's vitamins and a course of antibiotics for Lena. Robert nodded, taking mental notes. "What else do they need?" "Regular meals, warm shelter, rest." Dr. Patel's eyes met his, full of questions she was too professional to ask. "Should I contact Child Services? They have resources?" "No," Robert said quickly, perhaps too sharply. He softened his tone. "No, that won't be necessary. I'll ensure they receive proper care." Dr. Patel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Call me if anything changes. I'll check back in a few days." She squeezed his arm gently before leaving, the gesture full of unspoken understanding. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Robert prepared chicken soup for dinner, rich with vegetables and noodles. The girls ate at the kitchen table, their movements less guarded than before, though they still watched him carefully between spoonfuls. As Robert cleared the dishes, Nia's voice broke the silence. "Mom used to talk about you." The bowl in Robert's hands nearly slipped. He set it down carefully in the sink, turning to face the girls. "She did?" Nia nodded, her small face serious. She said you were a lawyer who had power, that you could have helped, but you turned away. Her voice held no accusation, just the simple clarity of a child repeating something often heard. Robert's throat tightened. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his movements slow and deliberate. Your mother, she worked at my firm? As an intern, Nia confirmed. She kept your card in her coat pocket for years, even after… She trailed off, her hand finding Lena's under the table. After what? Robert asked softly, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. After we lost our apartment, after the shelters started turning us away. Nia's voice grew quieter. After she got sick. Lena coughed, a wet sound that seemed to echo in the suddenly too quiet kitchen. Robert automatically reached for the cough medicine doctor. Patel had left, measuring out a dose with hands that weren't quite steady. When she died, Nia continued after Lena had taken the medicine, we ran. We didn't know what else to do. No relatives, no home, no help. She pulled the business card from her pocket, placing it on the table between them. This was all we had left. Robert stared at the card, its corners soft and worn from years of handling. His name stared back at him, embossed in elegant silver letters that now seemed to mock him. The girl's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of consequences he'd never considered. Why didn't you help our mom? The question came from both girls this time, their voices blending together in perfect unison. Robert opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? How could he explain the complexity of corporate law, of policy decisions, of turning a blind eye because it was easier? How could he tell these children that their mother's life had been worth less to him than his billable hours? He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Without a word, he walked to his study, the heavy door closing behind him with a decisive click of the lock. Inside, the room was dark except for his desk lamp. He moved to the old filing cabinet in the corner, pulling open the bottom drawer. The folder he sought was thick with age, its edges yellow and creased. Clause 17 was written across the tab in his own precise handwriting. Robert spread the documents across his desk, hands trembling slightly as he sorted through pages of legal language and policy recommendations. His own handwritten notes filled the margins, suggestions for tightening requirements, closing loopholes, making the language more precise. He found the core text of the clause and began to read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Section 3.1. Qualification for housing assistance shall be contingent upon proof of consistent employment for a minimum of 12 months prior to application. The words seemed to mock him now, each carefully crafted sentence revealing its true purpose: to exclude, to deny, to abandon. As his voice trailed off, a slight creak from the hallway caught his attention. He knew, without needing to check, that Nia was out there, leaning against the door, listening. He could almost picture her small form pressed against the wood, trying to understand the words that had shaped her family's fate. The paper trembled in his hands as he continued reading, each word landing like a stone in his stomach. The full scope of what he had helped create, the lives it had destroyed, the families it had torn apart, crashed over him in waves of understanding. Outside the study, Nia remained silent, a small sentinel bearing witness to his belated recognition of the damage he had done. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light across the granite countertop where Lena and Nia sat hunched over their drawings. Robert had found an old box of crayons in a desk drawer, forgotten remnants from when his nieces used to visit years ago. The waxy colors were worn down to stubs, but the girls didn't seem to mind. He stirred the pot of oatmeal slowly, adding a sprinkle of cinnamon and brown sugar. The familiar routine of cooking helped steady his hands, still shaky from a night of little sleep. Behind him, Lena giggled at something her sister had drawn. "Look," Nia said, holding up her paper. "It's the snow outside." Her drawing showed white flakes falling against a dark blue background, with two small figures holding hands beneath. Robert managed to smile as he served the oatmeal into 3 bowls. "That's very good, Nia." He placed the bowls in front of the girls, then settled into his chair at the kitchen table with his morning paper. The headline hit him like a physical blow. City reports fourth homeless death this winter. Below was a grainy photo of a snow-covered park bench, yellow police tape fluttering in the wind. Robert's hands tightened on the newspaper's edges, crinkling the thin paper. The girls' laughter faded as they noticed his reaction. The only sound in the kitchen was the soft scrape of spoons against ceramic bowls and the ticking of the old wall clock. Robert folded the paper carefully, tucking it away where the girls couldn't see. But the words had already burned themselves into his mind. 4 deaths. How many more went unreported? How many others, like Mara, had slipped away uncounted? After breakfast, while the girls worked on more drawings, Robert climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. Dust motes danced in the weak light from the small window as he pulled box after box from the shelves. His organizational skills hadn't extended to his personal archives. Files from 20 years of legal work lay jumbled together, waiting to tell their stories. He found the Housing Commission meeting transcripts first, thick stacks of paper held together with rusting staples. His younger self had made neat annotations in the margins. Emphasize economic impact. Reference property values. Cite public safety concerns. The language was careful, precise, designed to sound reasonable while hiding its true intent. Robert remembered sitting in those meetings, his expensive pen scratching notes while community members pleaded their cases. He had looked right through them then, seeing only obstacles to progress, problems to be solved. Internal memos from his firm revealed the strategy behind Clause 17. Client requires decisive action on urban renewal initiative, one read. Existing residents present significant obstacles to development timeline. Each memo was marked with his initials, RJM, signifying his approval. A yellow sticky note caught his eye, still clinging to a draft of the clause after all these years. His own handwriting stared back at him. Clean up wording. Remove racial identifiers. He remembered writing it, remembered being proud of his legal acumen. By removing explicit references to race, they had made the clause appear neutral while knowing exactly who it would affect. Robert's hands trembled as he unfolded a large city map marked with red circles. Each circle represented a neighborhood designated for urban renewal, a euphemism for demolition. The areas marked Priority Zone A formed a familiar pattern. Mara Deacon's old address fell right in the center of one of those red circles. He spread the documents across the dusty attic floor, piecing together the story they told. Every memo, every draft, every carefully worded regulation had been designed to achieve one goal: the systematic displacement of Black communities under the guise of progress. The afternoon light was fading when Robert finally descended from the attic, his arms full of damning evidence. He moved quietly through the house, not wanting to disturb the girls who were watching an old cartoon on TV. The fireplace in his study still held glowing embers from the morning. One by one, he fed the documents into the flames. The yellow sticky note curled and blackened. The memos dissolved into ash. The map with its red circles flared briefly before crumbling away. Each piece of paper represented lives disrupted, families torn apart, communities destroyed, all with his help, all with his signature. The fire cast dancing shadows on the study walls as Robert continued his task. He didn't hear the soft footsteps in the hallway, didn't notice Lena standing in the doorway until he turned to grab another stack of papers. She stood perfectly still, her small frame silhouetted against the darker hallway. Her eyes reflected the firelight as she watched him feed more documents into the flames. There was something in her gaze. Not accusation, not anger, but something deeper. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Robert froze, a half-burned memo still in his hand. For a long moment, neither of them moved or spoke. The only sound was the soft crackle of burning paper and the distant murmur of the television from the living room. Then, as silently as she had appeared, Lena turned and disappeared back down the hallway. Her footsteps made no sound on the carpeted floor, but Robert could feel her absence like a physical thing. He looked down at the papers in his hands, then back at the empty doorway. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the room, and Robert continued his task with renewed purpose. Each document he burned felt like both an erasure and an admission, a destruction of evidence and the acknowledgement of guilt. The fire consumed it all. The careful legal language, the strategic plans, the maps marked with red circles. But Robert knew the truth couldn't be so easily erased. It lived on in empty lots where homes once stood, in scattered communities, in the eyes of two little girls who had lost their mother to a system he had helped create. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the snow finally having exhausted itself overnight. Robert stood at the kitchen window, watching as weak sunlight tried to pierce through the thick clouds. The fresh blanket of snow covered everything in pristine white, untouched except for a few bird tracks near the bird feeder. Inside, the house felt stuffy after days of being closed up against the storm. Robert could hear the girls moving around upstairs, their footsteps light but distinct on the old wooden floors. They had slept in the guest room last night, finally comfortable enough to leave the living room couch. "Girls," he called up the stairs, "how about we get some fresh air today?" Two eager faces appeared at the top of the stairs. The past few days of regular meals and warm shelter had already begun to bring color back to their cheeks, but they were still wearing the same clothes they'd arrived in, now clean but obviously worn. "We don't have proper coats," Nia said, pulling at the thin sleeve of her jacket. Robert nodded, already heading toward the hall closet. "I think I have something that might work." He pulled out two wool coats that had belonged to his nieces years ago. The girls had left them behind during their last visit, and he'd never gotten around to returning them. They were a bit large on Lena and Naya, but with the sleeves rolled up, they would do. "Here," he said, helping them into the coats. "And these too." He found 2 pairs of mittens and some old scarves. The girls disappeared beneath the winter gear until only their bright eyes were visible above the wrapped scarves. The walk to the park was slow, their boots crunching through fresh snow. Robert kept a careful eye on both girls, ready to catch them if they slipped on hidden ice. But they moved with the sure-footed confidence of children, occasionally stopping to scoop up handfuls of snow or point out icicles hanging from tree branches. The small neighborhood park was deserted when they arrived, the swings dusted with snow and the slide too wet to use. Robert brushed off the swing seats with his gloved hands while the girls bounced impatiently beside him. "Higher!" Lena called out as Robert gave her a gentle push. On the swing next to her, Nia pumped her legs, trying to match her sister's height. Their laughter rang out across the empty park, echoing off the snow-covered trees. Robert stood back, hands in his pockets, watching them swing. For a moment, he could almost forget the weight of everything else. The documents he'd burned, the memories of Mara, the guilt that sat heavy in his chest. The girls' joy was infectious, their delight in simple pleasures a reminder of what childhood should be. He didn't notice the woman walking her dog along the path that skirted the park. She slowed as she passed, her phone coming up casually as if she were checking messages. The click of the camera was lost in the sound of the girls' laughter and the creak of swing chains. The woman, a middle-aged neighbor Robert recognized but had never spoken to, continued her walk without pausing. Her golden retriever pulled at the leash, eager to investigate the snowdrifts, but she hurried past, her fingers already typing on her phone. Later that afternoon, while the girls napped upstairs, exhausted from their outdoor adventure, the woman's post appeared in the Safe and Sound Neighborhood Watch Facebook group. "Anyone know this situation? Saw this at Marshall Park today? Looks off." The photo showed Robert standing behind the swings, his face partially turned away, while Lena and Naya swung in their borrowed coats. The comment started slowly at first. "Never seen those kids in the neighborhood before." "That's the old lawyer who lives in the Victorian on Maple, isn't he? Hope he's not pulling a white savior stunt. Should someone call someone?" Across town, in a small apartment cluttered with newspapers and case files, Zara Glenn scrolled through her Facebook feed during a quick coffee break. She'd been working since dawn, tracking down leads on the city's latest homeless death, adding to the thick file of evidence she'd been building all winter. The photo caught her eye mid-scroll. She nearly dropped her coffee mug as she recognized the 2 small figures on the swings. She'd seen their faces before, in a different photo, one attached to a missing persons report that had been quietly buried in the system. "That's them," she whispered, setting down her mug with trembling hands. "The twins from the Deacon case, the ones who had vanished after their mother's death." She'd been trying to track them for weeks, convinced their disappearance was connected to the larger story she was investigating. But what were they doing with Robert Marston? She recognized him too, though she'd never met him in person. His name appeared too many times in her research to be coincidental. Zara closed her laptop with a decisive click. She stood up, already mentally cataloging what she would need. Her camera went into her bag first, the good one with the zoom lens, then her notebook, filled with carefully documented evidence and interviews. Her phone buzzed with another Facebook notification about the post, but she ignored it. She knew where the Victorian house on Maple Street was. She'd driven past it dozens of times during her investigation, never guessing it would become relevant to her story. Now, finally, the pieces were starting to come together. The afternoon light filtered through the dining room windows as Robert carefully dusted the antique sideboard. The gentle swoosh of the feather duster provided a rhythmic backdrop to the girls' quiet playing in the living room. He paused occasionally to glance at them, still marveling at how quickly they had settled into the house's routines. The sharp ring of the doorbell cut through the peaceful atmosphere, making Robert start. He wasn't expecting visitors. Dr. Patel wasn't due back for days, and he rarely received unexpected company. Setting down the duster, he straightened his cardigan and made his way to the front door. Through the frosted glass panels, he could make out a woman's silhouette. When he opened the door, he found himself facing a professionally dressed black woman in her early 30s. She stood with the kind of confidence that suggested she was used to demanding answers, a leather messenger bag slung across her body, and a reporter's notebook held purposefully in one hand. "Mr. Marston," she said, not a question but a statement. "I'm Zara Glenn, investigative reporter." She held up a press badge. "May I come in?" Robert's hand tightened on the doorknob. His first instinct was to refuse, to protect the fragile peace he'd established with the girls. But something in Zara's steady gaze told him this wasn't a request he could deny. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Please come in," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Zara entered with measured steps, her boots clicking against the hardwood floor. Her eyes swept the entryway, taking in the antique furnishings, the carefully maintained woodwork, the subtle signs of wealth and privilege. Robert led her to the dining room, where afternoon sun streamed through tall windows onto the polished mahogany table. "Would you like some tea?" Robert offered, falling back on ingrained manners. "No, thank you," Zara replied, settling into one of the high-backed chairs. She placed her notebook on the table, uncapping a pen with deliberate precision. From their position, they could see into the living room where Lena and Nia sat on the floor, absorbed in a puzzle Robert had found in the attic. The girls looked up briefly at the new voice, but returned to their activity when Robert gave them a reassuring nod. "I see you've been taking good care of them," Zara observed, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "I'm doing my best," Robert answered, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Like you did for their mother?" The words hung in the air like frost. Robert's face changed, the polite mask slipping to reveal something raw underneath. Zara didn't wait for him to respond. "Mara Deacon," she continued, flipping open her notebook. 28 years old. Former legal intern at Marston Wheeler and Associates. Found dead from exposure 3 weeks ago behind the condemned Marshall Street shelter. She looked up. The same shelter that rejected her housing application 5 times in the past 2 years. All 5 rejections signed off by institutions receiving funding from your former firm. Robert's shoulders sagged. The weight of those facts seemed to physically press him down into his chair. "How did you find all this?" "I've been tracking winter homeless deaths for months," Zara explained, her voice taking on an edge. "Mapping patterns, following paper trails. Mara's name kept coming up, in protest records, in shelter documents, in legal filings. She was fighting something bigger than herself." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Something you helped build." "Clause 17, Robert said softly. "Yes." Zara's pen tapped against her notebook. "The Neighborhood Rehabilitation Initiative that just happened to target predominantly Black communities. The one that gave your firm's clients first rights to abandoned properties. The one you helped write." Robert didn't deny it. He looked toward the living room, where the girls were still playing, blissfully unaware of the heavy conversation taking place. "I can't change what I did," he said finally. "But please, don't publish anything yet. Let me fix it." A bitter laugh escaped Zara's lips. "Fix it? You're decades too late for that." She leaned forward, her voice intense but controlled. "Do you know how many families lost their homes because of that clause? How many children grew up in shelters? How many people died on the streets while your firm's clients built luxury condos?" "I know," Robert whispered. "I know now." Zara studied him for a long moment, then began packing up her notebook. "I'll be watching," she said, rising from her chair. "Every move you make, every call you place, every document you touch, I'll be tracking it all." Before heading to the door, she stopped in the living room entrance. Kneeling down, she smiled warmly at the twins. "Hi there," she said, her voice gentling. "I'm Zara." Nia looked up from the puzzle, studying Zara's face with that serious expression Robert had come to know well. Then, surprising both adults, she stood and walked over to give Zara a hug. Zara's professional demeanor cracked slightly as she returned the embrace, her arms tightening protectively around the little girl. Standing back up, Zara turned to Robert, her eyes narrowed, all warmth gone. "They trust you," she said quietly. "But I don't. Not yet." With that, she walked to the front door, pulling out her phone as she went. Robert heard her voice as she stepped onto the porch. "Hey, it's me. Get ready to clear the front page. I've got something big." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Robert standing in the suddenly quiet hallway, the weight of the past pressing down on him more heavily than ever. The night wrapped around Robert's Victorian home like a heavy blanket, but sleep remained elusive. He sat in his leather armchair by the window, watching fresh snow drift down in the amber glow of street lamps. His tea had gone cold hours ago, forgotten in his hands as his mind churned with memories and regrets. The harsh buzz of his phone cut through the silence, making him jump slightly. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. He answered with hesitation. "Mr. Marston." Zara's voice was clear and direct. "I want an interview." Robert's grip tightened on the phone. "Ms. Glenn, it's nearly midnight. This isn't a social call. I'm offering you a chance to tell your side before I start interviewing everyone else." Her tone left no room for negotiation. "Not off the record. Full history. Everything about Clause 17, the shelters, and what happened with Mara Deacon." Robert glanced toward the stairs where the girls slept peacefully. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. She paused. "Don't try to sanitize it, Mr. Marston. I want the ugly truth." The next morning arrived with gray skies and heavy clouds. Zara appeared precisely at 9, dressed in a crisp blazer and carrying professional recording equipment. Robert had prepared the dining room, clearing away breakfast dishes and setting out water glasses that neither of them would touch. The girls were upstairs in their room, occupied with books and toys Robert had purchased the day before. He'd explained that he needed to have an important conversation with Ms. Glenn, and they'd nodded with that uncanny adult understanding that sometimes broke his heart. Zara set up her voice recorder with methodical precision, testing levels and placing it carefully between them on the table. "This is Zara Glenn, interviewing Robert Marston regarding Clause 17 and related housing discrimination cases." She checked the timestamp. "Mr. Marston, let's start at the beginning." Robert's hands rested on the table, fingers laced together to hide their slight tremor. "It was 2003. The city was pushing for urban renewal, and our firm represented several major development companies. Who initiated Clause 17? The original draft came from city planning, but they needed our expertise to—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "To make it legally defensible." "You mean to hide the racial targeting?" Robert nodded slowly. "Yes. We received specific instructions to remove any explicit racial identifiers from the language. Instead, we used terms like priority zones and urban renewal areas." His voice grew quieter. "We all knew what those terms really meant." Zara leaned forward. "Walk me through the process." "We held meetings, dozens of them, refined the language, added layers of bureaucratic requirements. Robert's eyes grew distant. Every draft made it more complex, more impossible for affected residents to fight back. We created a maze of paperwork that would exhaust any opposition. And during this time, Mara Deacon was your intern? Robert's face tightened with pain. Yes, she was brilliant, caught things in contracts that even senior partners missed. She must have seen what we were doing, but I never... He swallowed hard. I never gave her concerns any weight. Tell me about her last day at the firm. She came to my office, had a letter about her family's eviction notice, asked if I could help, said it was urgent. Robert's voice cracked slightly. I told her it wasn't urgent enough to interrupt my work on Clause 17. I didn't even look up from my desk. Zara's pen scratched against her notepad. And the shelters? My firm financed 3 of them. Premier facilities, according to the press releases. Bitterness crept into his tone. But we implemented a vetting checklist designed to exclude credit checks, employment history requirements, documentation demands, all carefully crafted to disqualify nearly every family from low-income Black areas. Including Mara? 5 times. Robert's shoulders sagged. 5 times she tried to get help from shelters my firm helped build. 5 times she was rejected because of rules I helped write. The interview continued for hours, diving deep into the technical details of Clause 17, the political maneuvering, the calculated displacement of entire communities. Robert held nothing back, laying bare the cold machinery of institutional racism he'd helped construct. Zara asked pointed questions but remained professionally detached, her expression revealing nothing as Robert detailed his complicity in the system that had ultimately claimed Mara's life. When the last question was answered, Zara simply turned off the recorder and began packing her equipment. She offered no comment, no judgment, no indication of what she planned to do with the damning testimony she'd just collected. Robert sat there drained as she gathered her things. The weight of his confession seemed to press him into his chair. The house had grown darker as clouds thickened outside, and neither of them had bothered to turn on lights during the interview. After Zara left, or so he thought, Robert climbed the stairs to check on the girls. They had fallen asleep amid their books and toys, Lena's head resting on Nia's shoulder. The sight of them, so vulnerable and trusting, made his chest ache. He sat carefully on the edge of their bed, watching their peaceful faces in the dim light. "I'm so sorry, Mara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm sorry I didn't help when you asked." In the hallway, Zara stood silently, her recorder still running. She doubled back after pretending to leave, following an investigative instinct that told her the real story might come after the official interview. Now, watching Robert's unguarded moment of grief and remorse, her hard expression softened slightly, but only slightly. The truth she'd uncovered was too vast, too devastating for easy forgiveness. The early morning sun barely penetrated the heavy clouds, casting Robert's kitchen in a gentle gray light. Nia padded down the stairs in her borrowed pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She paused in the doorway, surprised to find Zara at the counter methodically dipping a tea bag into a steaming mug. "Good morning," Zara said softly, her professional demeanor from yesterday softened around the edges. "Would you like some hot chocolate? I found some in the cabinet." Nia nodded, climbing onto one of the kitchen stools. She watched as Zara moved around the kitchen with careful precision, heating milk in a pan and stirring in the chocolate powder. The familiar domestic scene felt strange in Robert's austere house. Small footsteps announced Lena's arrival. She clutched her worn stuffed rabbit, eyes still heavy with sleep, and wordlessly settled next to her sister. Zara prepared a second mug of hot chocolate, adding extra marshmallows she'd discovered in the back of a cupboard. The 3 sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the girls warming their hands around their mugs. Finally, Nia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know our mom?" Zara set down her tea, choosing her words carefully. "Not in person, but I knew of her. She used to call the newspaper where I work." She traced the rim of her mug with one finger. She would leave messages trying to tell her story. "Did you write about her?" Lena asked, marshmallow foam dotting her upper lip. "No." Zara's face tightened with old regret. Her story got buried. Other things took priority. Big political stories, celebrity scandals. She shook her head. "We should have listened." The kitchen grew quiet again, broken only by the soft clink of mugs against the counter. Nia stared into her hot chocolate, as if seeing memories swirling in the dark liquid. "The subway was warmest," she said suddenly, her voice distant. "When it was really cold, Mom would take us down there. We'd ride back and forth until morning." Lena nodded, hugging her rabbit closer. The red line was best, less police. Zara pulled out her small reporter's notebook, setting it on the counter without opening it. She didn't want to break the delicate moment by appearing too professional. "The shelters were worse sometimes," Nia continued, gaining confidence in her storytelling. "We'd walk for hours, trying different ones. They always had reasons to say no." "Too full," Lena whispered. "Wrong paperwork," Nia added. "No children allowed." "No single mothers." The list continued, each excuse a brick in the wall that had contained their world. Zara's hand crept toward her notebook, but she still didn't open it. "Mom would cry sometimes when she thought we were sleeping," Nia said, her young face carrying the weight of memories far too heavy for her years. "She'd say, 'A man could have helped us. He didn't.'" Zara leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice gentle. "Did she ever say his name?" Nia shook her head, but her eyes grew focused, remembering. "Just said he had a gold pen and shiny shoes." She paused, frowning. She used to touch that business card and say the pen was special, a gift. Now Zara did open her notebook, jotting down these details with quick, precise strokes. The girls watched her write, seemingly comfortable with the familiar action. Their mother had often written things down too, they explained, keeping careful records of every shelter visit, every rejection. The morning stretched on, sunlight gradually strengthening behind the clouds. The girls finished their hot chocolate and drifted into the living room to draw. Zara remained at the counter, reviewing her notes and waiting. Robert appeared around noon, looking tired but composed in his usual neat attire. He nodded a greeting to Zara, seemingly unsurprised to find her still there. "Mr. Marston," she said, her professional tone returning. "I have one more question." She glanced at her notebook. "Do you remember what pen you gave Mara that day?" Robert froze in the act of reaching for the coffee pot. His hand trembled slightly as he lowered it. "What?" "The pen," Zara repeated. The girls mentioned their mother talking about a special gold pen. A gift. Robert's face drained of color. Without a word, he turned and left the kitchen. They could hear his footsteps on the stairs, then the creak of floorboards above. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a wooden box, its surface dulled with age. With unsteady fingers, he opened the lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a gold fountain pen. The morning light caught its engraved surface, throwing tiny reflections across the kitchen walls. "It was a tradition," he said hoarsely. "Every promising intern received one at the end of their term. I gave this one to Mara the day before." He couldn't finish the sentence. Zara stared at the pen, her jaw tightening. "That's the one she described. No doubt." She reached for her notebook again but stopped, letting her hand fall back to the counter. Some details didn't need to be written down to be remembered. The ancient desktop computer hummed to life in Robert's study, its fan whirring like an asthmatic cat. The screen flickered, casting a blue glow across his tired face as he navigated through folders of archived emails. His hands moved slowly over the keyboard, each click deliberate as he searched through his digital past, fingers stiff with tension and dread. "There has to be something," he muttered, scrolling through endless chains of corporate correspondence. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but sleep was far from his mind. His eyes burned from staring at the screen, yet he couldn't stop now. A folder labeled Shelter Initiative 2005 caught his eye. Inside, hundreds of emails stretched across years of implementation. He opened one from the summer Mara had first come to his office, his heart pounding against his ribs as the message loaded. Subject: urgent intake protocol adjustment. 2 regional directors. From Operations Committee. In light of recent residential zone transitions, Clause 17 implementation, all affiliated shelters are advised to adjust intake protocols. Priority should be given to clients without prior eviction history. This will help maintain stable occupancy rates and prevent potential legal complications. Robert's throat tightened as he read further, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The carefully crafted language couldn't hide the truth. They had systematically blocked families displaced by Clause 17 from accessing emergency housing. The very people they had made homeless were being turned away because they were homeless. His own fingerprints were all over this policy, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic jargon he had helped perfect. He opened attachment after attachment, each revealing more layers of calculated cruelty. One memo detailed how to gracefully redirect applicants from destabilized zones, a euphemism for the predominantly black neighborhoods targeted by Clause 17. Another outlined risk management strategies for dealing with persistent cases. The clinical coldness of the language made his skin crawl. His cursor hovered over a spreadsheet titled High Risk Intake Monitor. With trembling fingers, he double-clicked, holding his breath as the file opened. Rows of names filled the screen, each coded with different colors and notations. He scrolled slowly, dreading what he might find. Halfway down the list, a familiar name jumped out at him. Deacon, Mara, W. Dependents. Her entry was marked in bright red. Next to it, a note, persistent, flagged for legal bait risk. Robert pushed back from the desk, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The room suddenly felt too small, too close, the walls seeming to press in on him. They had labeled her a risk not because she posed any danger, but because she understood too well what was happening to her community, because she might fight back, because she knew enough to cause trouble for people like him. The doorbell rang, startling him from his thoughts. He knew it would be Zara. They had agreed she would return tonight to review any findings. He made his way downstairs, checking on the sleeping girls as he passed their room. Their peaceful faces, so much like their mother's, sent another wave of shame through him. Zara stood on the porch, snowflakes catching in her dark hair. She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping past him into the warm house. "Show me what you found," she said, unwrapping her scarf, determination etched in every line of her face. In his study, Robert pulled up the emails while Zara set up her camera. She worked methodically, photographing screen after screen, her expression growing harder with each revelation. When she reached the spreadsheet with Mara's name, she paused, her finger hovering over the screen. "Legal bait risk," she read aloud, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They marked her as a threat because she was educated, because she had worked in your firm, because she might actually understand her rights." Robert nodded heavily, shame washing over him in waves. The whole system was designed to appear neutral while targeting specific communities. I, helped create a maze with no exit. The confession felt inadequate, hollow in the face of such deliberate harm. Zara's camera clicked rapidly, capturing every detail of the spreadsheet. "This isn't just a story anymore," she said, straightening up. "This is evidence. This is a class action lawsuit waiting to happen." She turned to face him fully, her eyes blazing with purpose. Every denial of service, every directed family, every child who spent winter nights in subway stations, it's all here in black and white. Or should I say red flags? The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as the snowstorm intensified. Robert stood at his desk, looking at the damning evidence glowing on his screen. The weight of years of willful ignorance pressed down on his shoulders until he felt he might collapse under it. Zara's voice cut through the silence. "You knew." The words fell like stones in the quiet room. You knew. Maybe not every detail, but you knew enough to stop it. Robert's hands gripped the back of his chair until his knuckles turned white. "And I didn't," he said softly, the admission tasting bitter on his tongue. "I know that now." She studied him for a long moment, her camera hanging forgotten at her side. The storm outside grew stronger, wind driving snow against the windows in white sheets, mirroring the turmoil inside the room. Finally, she nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. "Then help me burn it down." They sat in silence, the enormity of what they had discovered settling around them like dust. The computer screen continued to glow, its light illuminating the truth they could no longer ignore. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of justice long overdue. The morning sun struggled through thinning clouds, casting weak shadows across Robert's study. 2 days had passed since they'd uncovered the damning evidence, and the break in the weather felt like a chance to breathe. Robert watched from his window as Mrs. Langford, his silver-haired neighbor of 15 years, helped the girls into her sensible blue sedan. They were bundled up in new winter coats he'd ordered online, with proper boots and mittens this time. "We'll be back in an hour," Mrs. Langford called up to his window, her breath visible in the cold air. "The girls need their prescriptions from Dr. Patel, and we're running low on groceries." Robert nodded, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety that formed whenever the girls left his sight. But Mrs. Langford was trustworthy. She'd raised 3 daughters of her own and had been bringing him soup when he was sick for over a decade. The girls would be safe with her. He settled at his desk, pulling out the legal pad Zara had left him. The yellow pages seemed to mock him as he began writing his affidavit. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush. "I, Robert James Marston, being of sound mind, do hereby attest that in my capacity as senior partner at Whitman, Hayes & Associates, I participated in the drafting and implementation of Housing Ordinance Clause 17. His pen scratched across the paper, documenting years of carefully constructed discrimination. Each paragraph felt like lifting another stone off his conscience, revealing the rot beneath. He was so absorbed in his confession that he barely registered the first knock at his front door. When the second knock came, more urgent this time, he looked up. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Langford's car parked crookedly in his driveway. His stomach dropped. He found Mrs. Langford on his porch, her face ashen. Nia stood beside her, clutching her new coat with white-knuckled fingers. "Robert," Mrs. Langford's voice shook, "I'm so sorry. We were at Marshall's pharmacy. The girls needed to use the restroom. Nia came out. But Lena?" She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "She just vanished. We looked everywhere. The staff helped search. She's gone." The world tilted sideways. Robert steadied himself against the doorframe, forcing his voice to remain calm for Nia's sake. "How long ago?" 20 minutes. I called the store security right away, but they said their cameras don't cover that hallway. I drove straight back here." Robert was already pulling out his phone, dialing 911. Nia pressed against his side, silent tears running down her face. The operator's voice crackled through the speaker. 911, what's your emergency?" "I need to report a missing child," Robert said, his lawyer's training kicking in as he provided Lena's description, last known location, and what she had been wearing. "We'll dispatch officers to the pharmacy," the operator said, "but given the circumstances, we should issue an Amber Alert immediately." "Yes, please," Robert said, relief flooding through him. Then came the question that stopped everything cold. "Sir, are you the legal guardian of the child?" Robert's throat closed up. She's in my care." "But are you her legal guardian? Do you have custody papers or fostering documentation?" "No, but..." "I'm sorry, sir, but without legal guardianship, we cannot issue an Amber Alert. The responding officers will treat this as a priority missing persons case, but..." "She's 7 years old," Robert's voice cracked. "She's alone out there." "I understand your concerns, sir, but we have protocols." Robert ended the call, his hands shaking with rage. He immediately dialed Zara's number. She answered on the first ring. "What's wrong?" "Lena's missing. They won't issue an Amber Alert because I'm not her guardian. I need your help." "I'm on my way. Start checking security cameras at businesses near the pharmacy. I'll make some calls." The next hours passed in a blur of desperate searching. Robert and Zara drove through the streets surrounding the pharmacy, while Mrs. Langford stayed at the house with Nia. They showed Lena's photo to everyone they met. The police took statements but seemed more interested in questioning Robert about why the girls were in his care than in finding Lena. As night fell and the temperature dropped, they regrouped at Robert's house. Zara sat at his desktop computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard while she talked on her phone. "Yeah, those are the login credentials. Thanks, Marcus, I owe you." She typed rapidly, her face illuminated by the screen. "I'm in the system. Searching now." Robert paced behind her, wearing a path in his carpet. Nia had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep upstairs, but he couldn't rest, not until they found Lena. "There!" Zara's exclamation stopped him mid-stride. "Lena Deacon, status in temporary care, referred to Rose Point Home for Girls." "What?" Robert leaned over her shoulder, reading the entry. "How? Who authorized this?" "Emergency removal," Zara said grimly, scrolling through the file. "Based on a report of suspicious circumstances. Robert, someone saw that Facebook post. They used it to flag you as a potential threat to the girl's welfare." "They snatched her through a loophole," Robert whispered, rage building in his chest. The same kind of bureaucratic manipulation he had once specialized in had now been turned against him, and more importantly, against Lena. Zara was already standing, grabbing her coat. "Rose Point is about an hour north of here. If we leave now..." "We're going," Robert said, pulling on his own coat. He scribbled a note for Mrs. Langford, explaining where they were going and asking her to stay with Nia. They hurried out to Zara's car, their breath fogging in the cold night air. Fresh snow was starting to fall as they pulled out of the driveway, but neither of them suggested waiting for better weather. Somewhere out there, Lena was alone and scared, taken by the very system that had failed her mother. The car's headlights cut through the swirling snow as they drove north, both of them silent, both of them determined. They had to get her back. They had to make this right. The Rose Point Home for Girls loomed before them, a Gothic revival building with weathered brick walls and narrow windows that seemed to peer down at visitors like suspicious eyes. Iron gates stretched across the circular driveway, their black bars casting striped shadows in the glow of sodium lights. The snow had picked up again, dusting everything in a thin layer of white that made the place look even more forbidding. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled up to the security intercom. The dashboard clock read 9:47 p.m. Zara sat beside him, her phone ready to record, though hidden in her coat pocket. "Can I help you?" A tinny voice crackled through the speaker. "I'm here about Lena Deacon," Robert said, working to keep his voice steady. "She was brought here today without proper authorization. I need to see her immediately." A long pause followed. Then, "Please pull up to the main entrance. Someone will meet you there." The gates creaked open, and Robert drove through, parking in front of wide stone steps that led to heavy wooden doors. Inside the reception area, fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over institutional green walls and worn linoleum floors. A middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun sat behind a high counter, regarding them with open suspicion. "I'm afraid visiting hours are over," she said before they could speak. "And we don't allow unauthorized persons to see children in protective custody." "Protective custody?" Robert stepped forward, his voice rising. "She was taken from a pharmacy bathroom without cause or due process. I demand to see her immediately." The receptionist's lips thinned. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but we have protocols in place to protect vulnerable children, unless you can provide documentation proving guardianship." "She was under my care," Robert interrupted, "along with her sister, who is still at my home. They need to be together." "And what exactly is your relationship to these children?" The receptionist's tone grew colder. "Because according to our intake report, the child was found alone, with no verifiable guardian or caretaker present." Zara stepped up beside Robert. "I'm Zara Glenn from the City Herald. We have reason to believe this removal was conducted illegally, without proper cause or documentation. Would you care to comment on that for the record?" The receptionist's eyes narrowed. "One moment, please." She picked up a phone and spoke in low tones. Minutes later, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. A tall woman in a dark suit appeared, her badge identifying her as Ms. Peterson, Facility Supervisor. I understand there's some confusion about our newest arrival, she said, her voice professionally neutral. Perhaps we could discuss this in my office? They followed her down a corridor lined with religious artwork and inspirational quotes. Robert caught glimpses through open doors of sparse dormitory rooms with metal-framed beds. His stomach churned at the thought of Lena in one of those rooms, alone and frightened. Ms. Peterson's office was small but neat, with a cross hanging prominently behind her desk. She gestured for them to sit in straight-backed chairs while she settled into her leather executive chair. "Let me be clear," she began, folding her hands on the desk. Lena Deacon was found alone in a public space. When questioned by authorities, she could not provide the name or contact information of any legal guardian. Given her previous history of homelessness and the suspicious circumstances surrounding her recent living situation, emergency protective custody was deemed necessary. Suspicious circumstances? Robert's voice shook with anger. I was providing her and her sister with a safe home, proper medical care, and an unmarried elderly man taking in 2 young girls with no documentation or legal authority? Ms. Peterson raised an eyebrow. Surely you can understand our concerns. Zara leaned forward. And what documentation did you use to authorize this removal? Ms. Peterson pulled a file from her desk drawer and removed a form. Standard emergency placement authorization, all perfectly legal. Robert, with decades of legal experience, scanned the document. His face darkened. This is fabricated. The timestamps don't match. The authorizing signature is from someone who retired last year. And you've classified her as abandoned when you know exactly where her sister is. Serious accusations, Mr. Marston. Ms. Peterson's smile didn't reach her eyes. But unless you can provide proof of legal guardianship, Lena will remain in our care while proper placement is arranged. She needs to be with her sister, Robert insisted. You're traumatizing both girls by keeping them separated. We're protecting a vulnerable child from an unauthorized living situation, Ms. Peterson countered. Now, unless you have court documentation to present, I'm afraid this discussion is over. She stood, making it clear they were dismissed. As they walked back through the corridors, Robert caught movement in one of the dormitory rooms. Through the narrow window in the door, he saw Lena sitting on the edge of a narrow bed. She held something small in her hands, his old business card, torn but still recognizable. The sight of her there, alone in that cold institutional room, made his chest ache. We'll get her out, Zara whispered fiercely as they were escorted to the exit. They don't know who they're dealing with. Back in the car, Zara immediately pulled out her phone and began typing. The audio's clear. I'm posting it now on my anonymous blog, the one that broke the shelter discrimination story last year. Once people hear how they're twisting the rules to separate families and... Robert was already dialing another number. Judge Marion? I apologize for calling so late, but I need an emergency injunction. Yes, it's about the Deacon girls. He explained the situation rapidly, his legal training taking over despite his emotional turmoil. Zara's phone buzzed continuously as she posted the audio. Comments and shares began flooding in immediately. The public reaction was swift and angry, with local community activists already organizing responses. Inside Rose Point, in a room lit only by security lights from the parking lot, Lena sat cross-legged on her assigned bed. The torn business card trembled in her small hands as she traced the embossed letters of Robert's name. Through her window, she could see his car still sitting in the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the falling snow. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, just as she had done that first night at his window, and waited. The first rays of dawn were just breaking through Zara's apartment windows when her phone started buzzing incessantly. She rolled over, squinting at the screen, only to bolt upright at the flood of notifications. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through dozens of messages, calls, and social media alerts. The recording from Rose Point had spread like wildfire overnight. Local news stations were already running segments, their headlines flashing across her screen. 7-year-old taken without warrant? Questions arise over child's removal from pharmacy. Allegations of illegal child detention at religious facility. Zara's anonymous blog post had been shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from outraged citizens, community leaders, and legal experts. Her phone rang again. this time from her editor at the City Herald. "Glenn," he said when she answered, "this is explosive. How solid is your source material?" "Rock solid," Zara replied, already pulling on her boots while holding the phone to her ear. "I have the audio, witnesses, and documentation of their fabricated placement forms. They didn't expect anyone to check the details. Run with it. Full coverage, page 1. Zara grabbed her laptop and rushed out the door, navigating the icy morning streets to Robert's Victorian home. When she arrived, she found him already dressed in a suit, pacing in his study while on the phone. Nia sat cross-legged on the living room floor, methodically coloring in a picture book, but her usual energy was subdued. "When is Lena coming back?" Nia asked as Zara hung up her coat. The question hung heavy in the air, like the morning frost on the windows. "Soon, sweetheart," Zara assured her, though her heart ached at the girl's lonely figure against the massive furniture. "We're working on it right now." In his study, Robert was speaking in low, intense tones. "Yes, Judge Keller, I understand the unusual nature of the situation. No prior custody arrangement, but the circumstances. Yes, I have documentation of their mother's connection to my firm." Zara recognized the name. Judge Marcus Keller, known for his stern demeanor but fair rulings. Robert had mentioned mentoring him years ago when Keller was just starting his legal career. Robert's voice grew stronger. "I'm requesting an emergency hearing." "Yes, tomorrow would be—" "Thank you, Marcus. I appreciate this." He hung up and turned to Zara, his face showing the first glimmer of hope since Lena's removal. "We have a hearing tomorrow morning at 9. Judge Keller wants to review the case personally." Zara nodded, already typing on her laptop. "Good. I've got child rights attorneys reaching out. The Children's Defense Alliance wants to file an amicus brief. Civil rights groups are mobilizing. They're saying this highlights systematic issues with emergency removal policies." She showed Robert her screen, where emails from advocates and lawyers filled her inbox. The story had struck a nerve, especially among communities familiar with similar separations. Local activist groups were organizing a protest outside Rose Point for that afternoon. "We need to prepare a public statement," Zara continued. "Something that addresses both the immediate situation and the broader implications. The media's already asking for comments." They worked through the morning, crafting careful responses while keeping an eye on Naya. The little girl moved between activities restlessly, coloring, looking out windows, asking about Lena. Around noon, she brought them a drawing she'd made, 2 stick figures holding hands labeled "Me" and "Lena" in wobbly letters. Robert's hands shook slightly as he accepted the picture. "It's beautiful, Nia," he said softly. "Would you like to help me pick out some of Lena's favorite books to take to her tomorrow?" Nia nodded eagerly, and they spent an hour selecting stories from the small collection the girls had accumulated during their stay. Zara watched them, continuing to field calls and messages while coordinating with legal allies. As evening approached, the house grew quiet. The protest outside Rose Point had made the evening news, with concerned citizens holding signs reading, "Keep families together," and "Stop illegal removals." Zara's story in the City Herald was scheduled for the morning edition, complete with a timeline of events and expert commentary on the legal issues at stake. Robert had spent hours preparing his statement for court, documenting every interaction with the girls, his connection to their mother, and the circumstances that brought them to his door. His legal expertise showed in the careful construction of his argument, but there was something more personal in his words, a depth of feeling that transcended legal language. As the sky darkened outside, Nia grew increasingly subdued. She curled up in front of the fireplace with one of Lena's favorite blankets, still clutching her drawing. Robert watched her for a moment, then walked over and knelt beside her. "Nia," he said gently, meeting her eyes, "I'm going to bring your sister home tomorrow. I swear it." The little girl looked up at him, her face serious beyond her years. "Promise?" "I promise," Robert replied, his voice firm and clear. Nia nodded solemnly and closed her eyes, still holding the drawing of herself and Lena. Robert stayed beside her until her breathing evened out in sleep, then carefully adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. He walked back to his study, where case files and legal documents covered every surface. His court statement lay open on the desk, waiting for final revisions. The words blurred slightly as he stared at them, thinking of two little girls tapping on his window in the snow, of a business card carried for years by a desperate mother, of promises made and broken and made again. With steady hands, he picked up his pen and began to write. The juvenile courtroom buzzed with tension on that cold morning. Bodies pressed together on the wooden benches, a mix of activists, journalists, and lawyers, all straining to get a better view of the proceedings. The air felt thick with anticipation, and despite the no cameras signs posted prominently on the walls, several reporters clutched their notepads tight, pens hovering expectantly over blank pages. Zara sat rigidly on one side of the aisle, her dark blazer and pressed slacks a stark contrast to her usual casual attire. Her laptop remained closed on her lap, but her phone kept vibrating silently in her pocket, likely more messages from her editor demanding updates. She ignored them all, her eyes fixed on the empty judge's bench. Across the aisle, Robert looked smaller than usual in his charcoal suit. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged and rearranged the stack of documents before him. Every few minutes, he glanced back at Nia, who sat quietly in the gallery beside a young woman wearing a Child Advocates United badge. The little girl's feet didn't quite reach the floor, and she swung them nervously, her eyes darting between Robert and the courtroom doors. Judge Marcus Keller entered precisely at 9 o'clock, his black robe swishing as he took his seat. The bailiff called for all to rise, and the shuffle of bodies standing filled the room. Keller's face remained impassive as he surveyed the packed courtroom, but his eyes lingered briefly on Robert before he called the session to order. In the matter of emergency custody regarding Lena Deacon, Judge Keller announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, the state may present its case. The state's attorney, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s, rose smoothly from her chair. Her heels clicked against the floor as she approached the bench, her manner confident and practiced. Your Honor, she began, the facts in this case are clear and straightforward. On the afternoon in question, Lena Deacon, age 7, was found unsupervised in a public space, specifically the restroom of Wilson's Pharmacy. She was not in the custody of any legal guardian. No documentation existed to show any authorized adult was responsible for her care. The attorney paused, allowing her words to settle over the courtroom. The state, through its designated agencies, acted responsibly and in accordance with established protocols. When a minor is found in such circumstances, our primary duty is to ensure their immediate safety through proper channels. Rose Point Home for Girls is a licensed facility with a strong track record of temporary emergency placement. Zara's jaw clenched visibly at these words, and she raised her hand to be recognized. Judge Keller nodded, granting her permission to speak. Your Honor, Zara said, standing, I'd like to present evidence that directly contradicts the state's characterization of events. She stepped forward, producing a small digital recorder. With the court's permission, I'd like to play an audio recording from Rose Point Home for Girls, taken the night Lena was brought in. Judge Keller gestured for her to proceed. The recording filled the courtroom, voices sharp with tension, the clear sound of Robert demanding answers, the supervisor's dismissive responses, and most damning, the casual mention of a fabricated document regarding Lena's supposed abandonment. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The state's attorney shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Robert stood next, his trembling hands now steady as he lifted a folder. Your Honor, I have documentation showing both girls were under my care and receiving regular medical attention. He approached the bench, presenting the papers. Here are records from Dr. Patel, detailing examinations and prescribed treatments for both children. Additionally, I have receipts for clothing, food, and other necessities purchased for their care. Judge Keller examined the documents carefully, his expression thoughtful. The courtroom remained silent, waiting. Finally, he looked up, his gaze fixing on Robert with an intensity that made several observers shift in their seats. Mr. Marston, Judge Keller said slowly, deliberately, were you responsible for the creation of Clause 17? The question hung in the air like smoke. Nia sat forward in her seat, her small hands gripping the bench in front of her. Zara's breath caught audibly in her throat. Robert stood perfectly still, his shoulders straight despite the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon him. The silence stretched for several long seconds before he spoke. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "And it destroyed lives, including theirs, including mine." The admission seemed to fill the entire room. Judge Keller studied Robert's face for a long moment, then turned his attention to some papers before him. When he looked up again, his decision was written in his expression. "In light of the evidence presented and considering the circumstances surrounding this case," Judge Keller announced, "I am granting immediate custody of both Lena and Nia Deacon to Ms. Zara Glenn to serve as their legal guardian until permanent placement can be determined." Before he could continue, the courtroom doors opened. A social worker led Lena in, the little girl's eyes wide as she took in the crowded room. For a split second, she stood frozen in the doorway. Then she spotted Nia. "Lena!" Nia's cry broke the formal atmosphere as she leaped from her seat. The sisters collided in the middle of the aisle, their arms wrapping tight around each other. Tears streamed down both their faces as they clung together, Lena's shoulders shaking with sobs while Nia pressed her face into her sister's neck. The courtroom fell completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft crying of two little girls, reunited at last. Even Judge Keller remained still. His usual stern expression softened as he watched the sisters hold each other. The state's attorney looked down at her papers, her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked like shame. Zara pressed her hand to her mouth, tears gleaming in her own eyes, while Robert stood motionless, watching the scene with an expression of both joy and deep, abiding sorrow. The sisters continued to cry in each other's arms, oblivious to the crowd around them, lost in their own world of relief and love and reunion. The living room was quiet except for the gentle crackling of the fireplace. Snow fell softly outside the window, creating a peaceful backdrop that felt at odds with the weight of the moment. Robert sat in his leather armchair, his reading glasses folded neatly in his lap, while Zara occupied the corner of the sofa nearest to him. Between them, sprawled on the couch cushions, Lena and Nia slept soundly, their small bodies curled together like kittens. The girls' peaceful breathing seemed to fill the space between the adults. Their faces, so often marked by worry, were finally relaxed in sleep. Lena's hand was wrapped protectively around her sister's arm, as if ensuring even in sleep that they wouldn't be separated again. Robert watched them, his weathered face soft in the firelight. The flames cast dancing shadows across the room, highlighting the silver in his hair and the deep lines around his eyes. He seemed older tonight, as if the day's events had aged him further. Zara shifted in her seat, the leather creaking softly beneath her. She'd loosened her tie and rolled up her sleeves, but otherwise still wore her courtroom attire. Her laptop sat closed on the coffee table, its screen dark. She studied Robert's profile for a long moment before breaking the heavy silence. "You know they're coming for you now, right?" Her voice was quiet but firm, careful not to disturb the sleeping children. Robert didn't turn to look at her. He kept his eyes on the twins, a slight smile touching the corner of his mouth. After a moment, he nodded. "Good." The simple response hung in the air between them. Zara leaned back, considering him with new eyes. Morning arrived with a pale winter sun. Robert was already at his desk when the light first crept through his study windows. His computer hummed as he methodically organized decades of digital files. Emails dating back to the early drafts of Clause 17 filled his screen. Internal memos marked confidential sat in neat folders. The infamous spreadsheet containing Mara's name and hundreds of others glowed accusingly on his monitor. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Marcus, it's Robert Marston. Yes, it's been a while. Listen, I have a story you need to hear. Bring your recorder." Marcus Chen arrived within the hour, his press credentials hanging around his neck. He was younger than Robert remembered, but his eyes were just as sharp. They had worked together years ago when Marcus was just starting out as a legal correspondent. Robert had trusted him then. He would trust him now. "Everything?" Marcus asked, setting up his digital recorder on the desk between them. "Everything," Robert confirmed, gesturing to the stack of printed documents beside him. "Every email, every memo, every decision that led to Clause 17, the shelter funding guidelines, the vetting checklists designed to exclude specific neighborhoods, the whole corrupt machine." Marcus picked up the first document, scanning it with widening eyes. "This is explosive, Robert. You're named on half these papers. You'll be destroying yourself along with everyone else." "I know." Robert's voice was steady. "That's the point." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Robert's testimony was methodical, precise. He named names, described meetings, quoted conversations that had never appeared in any official record. He explained how the language of Clause 17 was deliberately crafted to appear neutral while targeting specific communities. "We called them priority zones," he explained, his voice thick with disgust, "as if we were helping those neighborhoods instead of destroying them." Marcus's recorder captured everything. Robert signed a detailed affidavit, his signature strong and clear at the bottom of each page. When they finished, the winter sun was already setting. "This will run tomorrow," Marcus said, carefully packing away his equipment and the documents. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Robert nodded. "It's time." The article hit the next morning. The headline blazed across the front page of the city's largest paper. He wrote the clause that broke thousands. Now he's naming names. By noon, Robert's phone was ringing constantly. He ignored it all, sitting calmly at his kitchen table as the storm broke around him. Zara arrived just as his email pinged with the first official notice. "The State Bar," he said, turning his laptop so she could see. "They're initiating disbarment proceedings." Zara read quickly, her expression grim. "Fast work. They're scared." Another email arrived. His bank, notifying him that several accounts connected to his legal trust funds had been frozen pending investigation. Robert deleted it without comment. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. His former law firm had released a statement. "The actions described in today's article do not reflect the values or practices of our firm. We categorically disavow Mr. Marston's conduct and are launching our own internal review." Zara watched him read it, her arms crossed. "You sure you're ready to lose everything?" Robert set his phone down carefully, looking around his kitchen. The twins' drawings were stuck to his refrigerator with magnets. Their school books sat on the counter. A half-finished puzzle they'd started that morning covered one end of the table. He thought of Mara, of her desperate note, of all the others like her who had been systematically pushed aside and forgotten. "I already did," he said quietly, meeting Zara's eyes. "This is just the paperwork." The city council chambers buzzed with tension on a cold February morning. Every seat in the public gallery was filled, with people standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The overflow crowd spilled into the hallways where dozens of former residents held up weathered eviction notices like battle scars. Faded photographs of demolished homes were displayed alongside portraits of loved ones lost to the streets. Zara Glenn stood at the podium, her professional demeanor masking the nervous energy that made her hands tremble slightly. She wore a crisp charcoal suit, her natural hair pulled back neatly. Before her, the council members sat in their elevated seats, some already fidgeting uncomfortably under the weight of the packed gallery's scrutiny. "What you're about to see," Zara began, her voice clear and steady, "is not just data. These are people, lives, families." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, displaying a map of the city overlaid with red dots. Each marker represents a family displaced by Clause 17. Not statistics, people. The screen changed to show a timeline of shelter rejections. Zara moved through her evidence methodically, presenting internal emails, rejection logs, and demographic data that revealed the systematic nature of the displacement. The council chambers remained eerily quiet, broken only by occasional gasps or murmurs from the gallery. "And this," Zara said, pulling up a new document, "is the vetting checklist used by shelters funded through private law firms. Note the coded language. prior housing instability, community risk factors, neighborhood stability index, all designed to exclude specific communities without explicitly naming race. In the front row of the gallery, Nia and Lena sat with their court-appointed advocate, watching Zara intently. Lena clutched a folder containing her mother's last photographs, while Nia held tight to her sister's hand. A councilman with silver hair and an expensive suit leaned forward, his expression dismissive. "Ms. Glenn, while these findings are concerning, isn't this proposal rather reactionary? We can't overturn years of housing policy based on emotional appeals." Zara's eyes narrowed slightly. She pulled up another slide, a detailed spreadsheet showing years of shelter rejection data. "Councilman Parker, I assume you're familiar with the Sterling report from 2019? Your firm commissioned it." She paused as the man's face paled slightly. "This data shows that families from predominantly black neighborhoods were rejected at 8 times the rate of other applicants. That's not emotion, sir. That's math." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Zara continued, her voice growing stronger. "But you want numbers? Here they are." She clicked through slides showing budget allocations, demographic shifts, and property value changes. In the 5 years following Clause 17's implementation, over 3,000 families were displaced. Shelter rejection rates in affected zones rose by 600%. And yes, we have names for every single case. She motioned to her assistant, who began distributing thick binders to each council member. The Deacon Act, which I'm presenting today, was crafted by housing reform lawyers, civil rights attorneys, and survivors of Clause 17. It mandates full transparency in shelter operations, eliminates racially coded filtering systems, and requires detailed documentation of all rejection decisions. Zara paused, then pulled up a final series of images. And this is Mara Deacon's story. The screen showed a timeline: employment records, rental applications, shelter rejection notices, hospital visits, and finally a death certificate. A mother of 2 who worked 3 jobs, who tried 7 different shelters, who kept detailed records of every rejection, who died of exposure in a parking garage while her daughters huddled beside her. The chamber fell completely silent. In the gallery, Lena buried her face in her sister's shoulder. "The Deacon Act ensures this never happens again," Zara concluded, her voice thick with emotion but still professional. "It provides oversight, accountability, and most importantly, humanity. Because the next Mara Deacon deserves better than a system designed to fail her." The council chambers erupted in applause. Even some council members were wiping their eyes. The chairman called for order, then announced they would proceed to a vote. The tension in the room was palpable as each council member's name was called. One by one, they voted. Even Councilman Parker, after a long pause, quietly voted aye. "The measure passes unanimously," the chairman announced, his gavel crack echoing through the chamber. "The Deacon Act is hereby enacted into law." The crowd erupted in cheers and tears. People hugged in the galleries and hallways. Decades of pain and frustration poured out in a wave of celebration. Zara quickly gathered her materials, then made her way to where Nia and Lena waited. She knelt down to their level, pulling them both into a tight hug. Their advocate smiled tearfully behind them. "Ready to go home?" Zara asked softly. The girls nodded, each taking one of her hands as they walked toward the building's exit. The crowd parted respectfully for them, some reaching out to touch Zara's shoulder or whisper quick thanks. As they stepped out into the snowy afternoon, protesters who had been waiting outside began to cheer. Signs bearing Mara's name and phrases like "housing is a human right" waved in the cold air. Zara paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the girl's small hands warm in hers. She looked back across the crowd, her eyes finding Robert standing quietly at the edge of the gathering. He wore his old wool coat, snowflakes gathering in his gray hair. He didn't smile or speak, just gave a single, solemn nod of acknowledgement. The late winter sun cast long shadows through Robert's study as he stood before the fireplace, methodically emptying his mahogany bookshelves. Each leather-bound volume felt heavier than he remembered. Decades of legal texts, case studies, and professional journals, the physical weight of a career built on carefully chosen words and strategic silences. He ran his fingers along the gold lettering of his constitutional law textbook before placing it in a cardboard box marked Donate. The official disbarment notice lay on his desk, the state bar's seal gleaming coldly in the afternoon light. The document was brief, clinical. Decades of practice reduced to a few formal paragraphs and a signature. The house felt different now, emptier yet somehow less burdened. The antique furniture and oriental rugs that had once seemed to whisper of success and legacy now stood as quiet witnesses to his transformation. As he worked, dust motes danced in the sunbeams, stirred by the movement of books that hadn't been touched in years. The doorbell chimed, breaking his concentration. He heard familiar voices, Zara's warm alto mixing with the higher pitch of children's excitement. The sound of small feet running across hardwood floors brought an involuntary smile to his face. "Mr. Goldpen," Lena called out, appearing in the study doorway. She wore a bright yellow sweater, her hair done in neat braids, Zara's handiwork, no doubt. Behind her, Nia carried a paper bag that smelled of fresh bread. "We brought dinner," Zara announced, following the girls into the room. She paused, taking in the boxes and half-empty shelves. "Spring cleaning?" Robert gestured to the disbarment notice. "Something like that." Zara nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Girls, why don't you set the table? I brought your favorite soup." The kitchen soon filled with the warmth of simple companionship. Steam rose from bowls of vegetable soup, chunks of crusty bread passed around the table. The girls chatted about their new school, their art classes, the friends they were making. Lena had joined the choir. Nia was learning to play chess. Robert found himself laughing more than he had in years. The sound surprised him, rusty but genuine. He watched Zara with the girls, noting how naturally they moved around each other now, a family built from shared pain and healing. "Show him your drawing, Lena," Nia urged between bites of bread. Lena pulled a folded paper from her pocket, carefully smoothing it out on the table. It showed 3 figures holding hands, herself, Nia, and their mother. In the background, she had drawn a house with smoke curling from the chimney, snow falling gently around it. The detail was remarkable for a child her age. "It's for the memorial," she explained quietly. "They're putting up pictures of everyone who got hurt by the bad rules." Robert's throat tightened. Zara reached over and squeezed Lena's hand. "It's beautiful, honey. Your mom would love it." After dinner, while the girls settled in the living room with their books, Zara pulled Robert aside. She held out an envelope, slightly yellowed with age. "We found this while organizing Mara's things for the memorial. It was in one of her journals." Robert's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in neat handwriting he recognized immediately. The same careful script from the intern applications he'd barely glanced at years ago. "To Mr. Marston," he read silently. "You probably don't remember me. You didn't look up when I asked for help. I just hope one day you will." The words blurred before his eyes. He read them again, then a third time, each line etching itself into his memory. The letter was both an accusation and a prophecy, a voice from the past that had finally made him look up far too late. Without speaking, he walked to his desk and opened the wooden box containing his gold fountain pen, the symbol of his former status that had become a marker in Mara's story. Carefully, he folded the letter and placed it inside, closing the lid with a soft click. Later that night, after Zara had taken the girls home, Robert stepped out onto his back porch. Fresh snow was falling, each flake catching the light from his windows before disappearing into the darkness. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of eventual spring. He stood there for a long time, watching the snow transform his garden into a blank canvas. Then, for the first time in nearly 30 years, he went to his garage and pulled out his old easel. Dust covered the wooden frame and the hinges creaked as he unfolded it. His hands remembered the motions as he set up a canvas and opened his ancient paint box. The tubes were dried and useless, but he had stopped at an art supply store earlier that week, drawn by an impulse he hadn't understood until now. Inside, through the window, He could see the girls' temporary bed by the fireplace, where they had insisted on napping before heading home. They slept peacefully, their faces softened by firelight, while the snow continued to fall outside. Robert squeezed paint onto his palette, colors he hadn't touched in decades. His first strokes were hesitant, but gradually grew more confident. The night deepened around him as he worked, but he barely noticed the cold. For the first time since the girls had appeared at his window that winter evening, he felt truly awake. Spring sunlight filtered through young leaves as people gathered in the newly dedicated Memorial Park. The late morning air carried the scent of fresh grass and early blooming flowers. A simple granite plaque stood at the center of a circular garden, its polished surface reflecting the clear sky above. The words etched into the stone were stark and unflinching. In memory of Mara Deacon, and the lives her voice could have saved if someone had just listened. Around the plaque, white roses bloomed, planted by community members who had known Mara, or others like her. Rows of folding chairs faced the memorial, filled with activists, community leaders, and families who had survived Clause 17. Children played quietly in the background while their parents spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of displacement and survival. Robert stood at the edge of the crowd, wearing a simple gray sweater and slacks. His silver hair caught the sunlight as he kept his eyes fixed on the plaque. He held no program, carried no camera, just stood in respectful silence as others filed past him to find seats. Zara approached the small podium set up beside the memorial. She wore a deep blue dress, her natural hair crowned with small white flowers. Nia and Lena stood beside her, both in matching white dresses, their hands clasped together. At 9 years old now, they stood taller, healthier, their eyes bright with intelligence and growing confidence. 1 year ago, Zara began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. We stood in a courtroom fighting for 2 little girls who had lost everything. Today we stand here to honor their mother, and to ensure her story is never forgotten. She paused, looking down at the twins beside her. Mara Deacon wasn't just a statistic. She wasn't just another victim of a broken system. She was a mother who fought until her last breath to protect her children. She was a voice crying out for justice in a world that had turned away. The crowd remained silent, many nodding in recognition of their own struggles. Some wiped away tears. This memorial, Zara continued, gesturing to the garden around them, isn't just about remembering loss. It's about acknowledging responsibility. It's about facing hard truths and demanding better. The Deacon Act has already helped hundreds of families find stable housing, but our work isn't done. Nia squeezed her sister's hand tighter as Zara spoke. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they found Robert's familiar figure. He stood perfectly still, his face a mask of quiet grief and acceptance. Mara once wrote that all she wanted was for someone to look up from their desk and see her humanity. Zara's voice softened. Today we're not just looking up, we're standing up. We're speaking up, and we're making sure no one can ever look away again. As the ceremony concluded, people began to disperse slowly, some leaving flowers by the plaque, others lingering to talk in small groups. Robert remained where he had stood throughout, making no move to approach the memorial. Suddenly, Nia broke away from Zara's side. She ran through the crowd, her white dress billowing, and threw her arms around Robert's waist. He staggered slightly, surprised by the force of her embrace, then gently placed his hands on her shoulders. Lena followed more slowly, but her hug was just as fierce when she reached him. Robert knelt down to their level, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Zara approached last, her heels clicking softly on the garden path. She stood before Robert as he rose, her expression complex, a mixture of hard-won respect and lingering judgment. She placed a hand on his shoulder, the touch firm but not unkind. "You're still not forgiven," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "But you're not forgotten either." Robert nodded, understanding the weight of her words. They stood together for a moment, watching as the last visitors left the garden, leaving only the sound of birds and rustling leaves. Later that evening, snow began to fall, unusual for early spring, but beautiful as it dusted the new growth with white. The twins played in Robert's front yard, their laughter carrying through the crisp air as they tried to catch snowflakes on their tongues. Lena paused in her play, walking toward the line of bare trees at the edge of the property. Her dark eyes grew distant as she watched the snow swirl between the branches. "Mom said he was a bad man," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the quiet of falling snow. Nia stopped making snow angels and looked at her sister. Her face showed wisdom beyond her years as she replied softly, "Maybe, but he's different now." They turned back toward the warm light spilling from the house's windows, their footprints marking fresh paths in the gathering snow. Inside, they could see the fireplace glowing, promising warmth and hot chocolate. Robert stood at the window watching them return. His hand pressed gently against the cold glass, exactly where their small hands had once tapped in desperate hope on that winter night that changed everything. The reflection in the window showed his face, older, humbler, but somehow more alive than it had been in decades. The same window that had once framed his moment of recognition now framed his daily reminder of both redemption and responsibility. His fingers traced the spot where desperate little Knuckles had once knocked, seeking help that had finally, belatedly, been given. If you enjoyed the story of Nia and Lena, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.